General George Marshall sat in a quiet Washington office on May 22, 1940. He was looking at a list of hardware that represented the razor-thin margin between national security and total vulnerability. Beside him stood the Chief of Ordnance, and between them lay a ledger of rifles, machine guns, and field pieces. This was not a procurement list for a growing army, but a tally of everything they were about to give away. As the German blitzkrieg tore through the Low Countries, Marshall signed the order to strip the United States Army of its meager munitions to help a collapsing Britain. At that moment, the national inventory was little more than a ghost of a modern force. The entire country possessed only 8 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 13 105mm howitzers. To understand the weight of that signature, you have to look at the piers where those crates were loaded. Clerk Evans stood on a cold dock that May with a clipboard in his hand. He checked off the serial numbers of rifles from the Great War as they were craned into the holds of ships bound for the Atlantic. Evans was watching the last of the nation's reserves disappear into the fog. He knew that back at his home station, the new recruits were drilling with wooden broomsticks because there was nothing else to give them. This was a legal fiction called surplus, where every box of ammunition sent to London was a high-stakes gamble on the survival of the British Empire. The National Armoury was empty, as the last ship vanished. Leaving the American armories hollowed out, a single question remained for the men left behind. How did a starving army build the world's greatest weapons machine? The answer is not found in a sudden miracle of industrial output, but in the 20 years of stagnation that came before the crisis. Following the 1918 armistice, the Ordnance Department had shriveled into a skeletal institution. By 1924, the annual budget for weapons had plummeted to roughly $5,800,000. This was a mere 2% of the total War Department budget. A small staff was forced to manage over $1 billion worth of decaying property, while being systematically dismantled by budget clerks and isolationist policy. The men tasked with defending the country became paper planners and technical hobbyists. While the public embraced a return to normalcy, ordnance officers were reduced to using unskilled laborers from unemployment rolls just to slush machinery with grease to prevent rust. At the Springfield Armory, the civilian laboratory staff was slashed from 16 men down to 4. In the quiet of these arsenals, a specialized atmosphere took hold born out of a lack of anything else to do. They refined blueprints and standardized the turn of a screw for weapons they had no money to build. It was a bureaucracy that lived in 22,000 linear feet of shelf space. These officers preserved their craft through mimeographed mobilization plans that sat in filing cabinets for 2 decades. They were legally barred from even asking Congress for the money they knew was necessary. By 1939, when the war clouds finally broke over Europe, 20% of the nation's powder stocks were already rotting. The gap between the paper plans and the reality of the modern battlefield was a terrifying chasm. But to understand how the shelves became so empty, we must look back 20 years to a nation that had turned its back on the very idea of war. Between 1919 and 1939, the Technical Bureau functioned as a massive intellectual storage unit. It was a repository for expertise that the nation seemed determined to forget. Because there was no money for steel, the engineers fought their battles on graph paper. They obsessed over a theoretical framework for a conflict they could not afford to fight. They were not building weapons, they were building the idea of weapons. These ballisticians and engineers sat in dusty offices, surrounded by blueprints for tanks that would never be cast in iron. They focused on precision because precision was the only thing that was free. To understand how high the pressure eventually became, you have to look at the workspace of men like draftsman Kelly. In the late spring of 1940, as the news of the German breakthrough in France reached the capital, the theoretical world suddenly collided with reality. Kelly did not leave his office for 72 hours. He slept on the floor under his drafting table in a windowless room, surrounded by the smell of ammonia and ink. He was frantically finalizing the mobilization blueprints, knowing that if the factories ever did start up, they would need a map to follow. He raced a collapsing continent. But a map is useless without a way to navigate it. Years before the crisis in 1931, the agency had undergone a quiet reorganization that would eventually save the Allied cause. It was called the district system. The nation was carved into 13 regional hubs, each centered in a major industrial city like Pittsburgh or Detroit. Instead of every contract being funneled through a single office in the capital, the Bureau moved its authority closer to the factory floor. This system created a bridge between the military hierarchy and the pragmatism of private business. It allowed the service to recruit civilian industrialists who understood production better than any career officer. These men did not care about salutes. They cared about machine tool hours and the flow of raw materials. District Chief Barnes was the embodiment of this new, aggressive style of procurement. He understood that the 3-month approval bottleneck in the capital was a greater threat than any enemy army. In 1940, Barnes met with a factory owner in a crowded hotel lobby. There were no formal ceremonies and no stacks of forms. Barnes knew the nation needed shells, and he knew this man could make them. He pulled out a cocktail napkin and scribbled the terms of a multi-million-dollar manufacturing contract. He signed it over coffee cups. That handshake bypassed years of red tape. It was a signal that the era of paper planning was over and the era of production had begun. The Bureau had spent 20 years preparing on paper, and now it was reaching out to the men who owned the lathes and the furnaces. They were no longer curators of a technical museum. They were managers of the largest industrial machine in human history. The transition was frantic and often messy, but the foundation laid during those quiet years held firm. The paperwork was finally becoming hardware. For 2 decades, they lived on a diet of blueprints and hope. Then, in the spring of 1940, the world caught fire. The fall of France in June 1940 acted as a violent catalyst. It turned the slow-moving bureaucracy of the previous 20 years into a high-pressure engine. Before the German tanks reached the English Channel, the American procurement strategy was defined by a frugality that treated every nickel as a national treasure. Suddenly, the illusion of a quiet war evaporated. Congress, which had spent 2 decades starving the military, pivoted in a matter of weeks. They voted for 14 times the funding the technical services had received in the preceding 20 years combined. But money alone does not build a tank. In 1939, the government-run arsenals could only produce 5% of what the army required. The other 95% had to come from private factories that had spent the last 2 decades making refrigerators and sewing machines. These companies did not know how to work with armor plate or how to machine the rifling in a heavy gun. To bridge this gap, the service issued what they called educational orders. It was a $2 million gamble designed to prime the industrial pump. The military bypassed the usual low-bid competitions and essentially paid private firms to learn. They were not buying shells yet, they were buying the knowledge of how to make them. On the factory floor, the pressure was immense. Civilian workers used to the loose tolerances of a hunting rifle were suddenly told to work within a 10,000th of an inch margin. In a freezing loading plant in Ohio, Inspector Reed became a human safeguard against catastrophe. She was part of a new wave of civilian specialists, tasked with catching the errors that a machine might miss. Reed discovered a microscopic hairline fracture in a 155mm shell casing by running her bare fingernail along the cold steel. That single silent catch prevented a gun from exploding in the face of an American crew months later. Technical perfection had to meet the desperate need for quantity. By early 1941, the challenge shifted from learning how to build to figuring out what to build. The passage of the Lend-Lease Act in March meant the United States was now arming the world. This created a logistical collision known as the Battle of the Types. The British were calling for their own specialized designs, while American engineers pushed for standardized domestic models. At the Frankfurt Arsenal, the British sent over a 40mm gun they wanted produced in mass quantities, but they never provided the blueprints. The staff had to disassemble the weapon and manually create 600 individual gear drawings just to start a production line. This friction threatened to halt the entire rearmament program until the British finally agreed to adopt American standard designs. Reliability mattered more than technical perfection. This explosion of production created a secondary crisis at the water's edge. Thousands of vehicles and millions of rounds of ammunition were pouring out of factories, but shipping schedules were irregular. The ports were becoming bottlenecks. On a rain-slicked pier in New Jersey, warehouseman Gomez stood amidst 3,000 military trucks that had no ships to carry them. If those trucks stayed on the dock, the port would seize up. If they were sent back to the factory, the assembly lines would stop. Gomez organized the entire lot using nothing but a pocket watch and a box of colored chalk. He marked the pavement, timing the arrival of every crate to match the shifting tides and the erratic arrival of convoys. He turned a warehouse into a filing cabinet. Inside the newly rising Pentagon, General Levin H. Campbell Jr. was watching this transition with a wary eye. He knew the old atmosphere of the pre-war administration was dead. He began pushing for a philosophy where a single officer was responsible for a weapon from the first drawing to its final salvage. He was fighting a war of policy against the centralized control of General Brehon Somervell. Campbell brought in industry titans from the automotive world to act as his vice presidents. He treated the department like a multi-billion-dollar corporation rather than a military branch. This was the birth of the Industry Ordnance Team, a partnership that replaced rigid salutes with an informal business handshake. By the end of 1942, the department was overseeing $3 billion in contracts for 3 million vehicles. The machine finally had a single rhythm. By the summer of 1942, the industrial machine was screaming at full throttle, but the gears of the bureaucracy were beginning to smoke. While the production lines were working 3 shifts, the administrative heart of the army was still operating on a pre-emergency pulse. It was a world where paperwork moved at a leisurely pace, while the front lines were begging for spare parts. In May of that year, a team of investigators arrived in New York to conduct a forensic audit of failure. Surveyor Holmes was one of the men tasked with walking through these procurement offices. He did not find the frantic energy of a nation in a fight for survival. Instead, he found a stagnant bureaucracy paralyzed by its own red tape. Whenever Holmes found a desk that did nothing but shuffle papers, he did not file a report. He simply took out a red pen and marked a large X directly on the desk of the man who was slowing down the war. The old way of business was dying. This survey became the catalyst for a period known as the Great Divide. The old way of doing business was dead, and by the summer of 1942, the army had to choose to evolve or collapse. At the center of this storm was General Somervell, the man charged with the nearly impossible task of rewiring the military-industrial interface. Somervell was a relentless driver who viewed administrative friction as a form of sabotage. He launched a brutal internal struggle to consolidate the technical branches into a single, centralized command called the Army Service Forces. To understand why this change was so explosive, you have to see it through the eyes of the technical specialists. These were men who had spent their entire careers mastering the science of munitions and ballistics. They viewed the new management experts as parachute jumpers who dropped into a specialized world with no understanding of how to build a tank or a fuse. The friction was constant. The specialists wanted technical perfection, while the new administrative supervisors demanded speed and volume. The old guard argued that you could not manage the production of a high-velocity gun the same way you managed the production of boots or blankets. By August of 1942, the tension reached a breaking point. The new chief of the munitions branch realized the bottleneck was not in the factories, but in the capital itself. Every hiring decision and every contract change had to be funneled through a single office in Washington. It was a recipe for paralysis. The resolution arrived through a radical administrative mandate known as Orders M. This was the moment the mirror of failure finally forced a change. In a single stroke of the pen, the central authority was stripped of its micromanagement powers. Responsibility for personnel and production was pushed out of the capital and into the field installations. It was a total decentralization of power. The goal was to move the decision-makers as close to the factory floor as possible, replacing central control with individual accountability. This shift fundamentally altered the social and professional landscape of the entire military. It forced the integration of a new kind of workforce. By September, the Manpower Conservation Program mandated that women be moved into roles previously held by men. They were no longer an auxiliary resource. They had become the backbone of the industrial machine. The munitions branch was no longer a small agency, but a massive, decentralized industrial manager. This was the Great Rewiring. The system moved from a chaotic state of induction to a merit-based policy that prioritized results over protocol. The country club had been shuttered, replaced by a high-stakes corporate military hybrid that valued the flow of hardware over the preservation of red tape. It was a brutal evolution that proved the human infrastructure of the victory was as vital as the steel it produced. No one asked for a second opinion. General Levin H. Campbell Jr. sat in his office, staring at a map that represented a logistical nightmare. It was mid-1942, and he had just inherited a department that was attempting to eat an elephant. His solution was a management mantra that would define the rest of the struggle: cut the animal into small pieces. The largest piece, the one currently choking the entire military system, was the tank and truck program. Washington was 1,000 miles away from the steel mills and the grease pits, and Campbell realized that this distance was a bottleneck that could no longer be tolerated. To understand why his next move was so radical, you have to look at the map from his perspective. The United States was essentially fighting an internal civil war over hardware. The Quartermaster Corps owned the trucks and the jeeps, while the munitions branch owned the tanks. This was a catastrophic duplication of effort. Two different sets of officers were competing for the same engines, the same rubber tires, and the same assembly line hours. General Somervell finally lost his patience and ordered a total merger. He told Campbell to take over the whole lot, covering every military vehicle with an internal combustion engine. Campbell knew that if he tried to manage 3 million vehicles from a desk in the Pentagon, the program would collapse under the weight of its own paperwork. He did not just want to merge the departments, he wanted to physically move them. He picked up the heart of the American Armor program and transplanted it into the Union Guardian building in Detroit. This was the birth of the Tank Automotive Center. By moving the headquarters to the factory floor, Campbell had done more than change a mailing address. He had rewired the mechanical heart of the war. Now consider the psychological shift this required. For over a century, the army had manufactured its own weapons in isolated government arsenals. Now, they were setting up shop in the headquarters of the very companies that had built industrial America. The Great Move saw hundreds of officers and thousands of civilians packing their files and boarding trains for the Midwest. They were leaving the quiet halls of the capital for a city that lived by the rhythm of the assembly line. Inside the new Detroit center, the culture clash was immediate. Career generals were forced to work alongside industrialists who had been brought into uniform to manage production. These newcomers did not care for the rigid army hierarchy. They brought in corporate executive committees and complex flowcharts. In those early months, the atmosphere was chaotic. One officer complained that there were too many chiefs and not enough Indians, as high-ranking officials tripped over each other to define their new roles. They were trying to build a hybrid organization that was half military and half corporation. The skepticism from the military's old guard was thick. Many believed that civilian factories, used to the loose tolerances of a family sedan, could never meet the standards required for a high-velocity gun. This is where the individual skill of the American worker broke the deadlock. Machinist Morris was one of those men who operated in the shadow of the massive plants. He worked in a small garage-turned-factory, with tools that were older than he was. To prove that the civilian world could meet the mission, Morris spent 18 consecutive hours hand-filing a single experimental gear. He worked under a flickering light bulb, ignoring the fatigue until the piece of steel was so precise it met every military specification to the letter. That one gear proved the industry ordnance marriage was more than just a theory. It was a reality. By early 1943, the center in Detroit was overseeing 4,000 individual contracts. They were not just buying tanks, they were managing the evolution of the weapon itself. They had moved from the isolation of pre-war research into a high-pressure environment where an engineering flaw found on a Tuesday could be corrected on the assembly line by Thursday. The distance between the drawing board and the front line had been shortened. The move to the factory floor had stripped away the last layers of peacetime stagnation. Campbell had cut the elephant into pieces, and in the process, he had given the army a mechanical pulse that beat in time with the industrial power of the nation. The bottleneck in Washington had been broken. The tanks were finally rolling. By the spring of 1941, the industrial machine was beginning to hum, but the military faced a new and terrifying bottleneck. They had the hardware, but they did not have the men who knew how to fix it. To understand the scale of this failure, you have to look at the training grounds as they existed before the emergency. In 1940, the entire technical training program consisted of about 375 officers and a few thousand enlisted men. They were museum soldiers, trained in a quiet and academic environment where they studied engineering drawings in clean classrooms. As the German invasion of the Low Countries shattered the peace, that leisurely model evaporated. The technical service was suddenly tasked with growing its ranks by 700% in a single year. When the first wave of recruits arrived at the newly activated training center at Aberdeen, they did not find a sophisticated school. They found unfinished barracks with no screens on the windows and freezing showers. There were thousands of men arriving, but for the first few months, the entire training fleet consisted of exactly 10 condemned trucks. Think about what this meant for the instructors. They were trying to teach complex mechanical repair to men who in many cases had never seen the inside of a tank. To understand how they closed this gap, you have to look at the work of men like Sergeant Hawks. He was part of a skeleton crew of instructors who were being crushed by the sheer volume of students. Hawks did not have the luxury of a prepared curriculum or a staff of assistants. Every night, he stayed awake until 3 in the morning, sitting under a flickering bulb in a drafty barrack and reading a technical manual by flashlight. He was desperately memorizing the assembly sequence of a new transmission so he could stay exactly one lesson ahead of his students the next morning. He was a man holding back a flood with a single textbook. By 1942, General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. realized that rote classroom drill was a luxury the Army could no longer afford. He pushed for a transition to what he called combat realism. The munitions branch stopped worrying about whether a man could march in a straight line and started worrying about whether he could change a piston ring in a mud hole while someone was shooting at him. They slashed the time spent on close-order drill to less than 5% of the schedule and replaced it with 75 hours of intensive rifle, marksmanship, and malaria control. The training ground at Aberdeen became a sensory gauntlet. They built a 500-yard course filled with log mazes, rope traverses, and gas chambers. But the real lesson was in the rest periods. Instructors would wire the doors of latrines and discarded soda bottles with small firecrackers to simulate booby traps. To understand the impact of this, imagine a class of exhausted recruits finishing a lecture on engine maintenance. The instructor would dismiss them for a break, and as the men walked toward the latrines, a cacophony of small explosions would go off under their feet. It was a brutal way to teach a mechanic that in a modern war, there is no such thing as a rear echelon. If you could not survive a firefight, your technical skills were useless to the men at the front. Even with this frantic pace, the Army could not build a professional maintenance force fast enough. A standard technical education took 9 months, but the service only had 12 weeks. This is where the affiliated units gamble changed everything. Instead of trying to teach a soldier how to be a mechanic, the Army decided to ask civilian mechanics to bring their tools to the war. They turned to the National Automobile Dealers Association and launched a massive recruiting drive in the heart of the American car industry. To understand how this looked on the ground, you have to see recruiter Sloan. In late 1942, Sloan was not working out of a polished office. He stood on a wooden soapbox outside a shuttered Ford plant in the middle of a cold rain. He was not promising a career or a technical education. He was looking for men who already knew how to pull an engine in the dark. Sloan stood there for hours, shouting over the noise of the street, convincing 500 unemployed mechanics to join the service in a single afternoon. These men were often older, with families and established lives, but they were the fighting technicians the Army desperately needed. They traded their high-paying civilian jobs for a soldier's pay and a set of olive drab coveralls. This influx of civilian expertise transformed the maintenance of the entire force. These men did not need to be taught what a carburetor was. They just needed to be shown where the Army kept the spare parts. By late 1944, this improvised mixture of combat realism and civilian expertise had achieved a standard of readiness that was the envy of every other branch. The service had moved from a state of total neglect to a model of industrial efficiency in less than 3 years. They had stopped trying to turn soldiers into mechanics and started turning mechanics into the mechanical heart of the Allied victory. The mechanics were no longer just civilians in uniform. They were ready for the field. To understand the distance the nation traveled, we have to go back to that pier in 1940. Think about Clerk Evans standing by the crates of vintage rifles, watching the last of the American reserves disappear into the Atlantic fog while recruits back home drilled with wooden broomsticks. In that moment, the United States was a hollow shell, a nation with 8 anti-aircraft guns and a handful of modern tanks to its name. The surplus was a legal fiction, and the armories were empty. Now, jump forward to late 1944. The landscape has been utterly transformed. The industry ordnance machine that was once just a collection of mimeographed plans in a filing cabinet has become an ocean of steel. The numbers are almost impossible to visualize. 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 12 million rifles, and 3.5 million military vehicles. This was not just a byproduct of industrial might. It was the result of the 6 permanent arsenals acting as schoolmasters for private industry, teaching civilian factories how to work within a 10,000th of an inch margin of error. This is the moment the machine finally justified the 20 years of lean planning. The technical breakthroughs that had been stifled by the dead hand of conservative military doctrine were finally unleashed. The bazooka rocket launcher, the proximity fuse, and the complex tank transmission moved from the drawing board to the front lines. The military had moved away from government-run arsenals toward an integrated network of private contractors and civilian scientists. These experts were no longer treated as house guests, but as the architects of victory. But the real answer to our question, how did a starving army build the world's greatest weapons machine, is not found in a factory ledger. It is found in the dirt. To understand this, you have to look at the fighting technician. The men who took the specialized knowledge of the arsenals and carried it into the fire. The answer was not just the capacity of the factories, but the decentralized initiative of the men in the field. The machine worked because the experts were finally given the authority to act. In London, Captain Vance crawled into a mud-filled crater to face a 4,000-pound German bomb known as a Satan. The fuse was a mechanical nightmare where the slightest tremor could trigger a blast large enough to level the entire block. Vance lay in the cold mud and bit his lip until it bled to keep his hands from shaking while he unscrewed the mechanism. He was not just a soldier, he was a specialist who had been given the authority to make life-or-death technical decisions without waiting for a command from a distant headquarters. Thousands of miles away, in the middle of a blinding North African sandstorm, Private Bull Miller stood over a medium tank with a shattered transmission. In the pre-war army, a repair of this magnitude would have required sending the vehicle back to a rear area depot for several weeks. But Miller had been trained in the new philosophy that brought the expertise of the factory directly to the front line. He did not have a specialized workshop or even a clean floor to work on. Miller rebuilt the entire transmission in the middle of the desert using only a crowbar and a heavy rock. He was the human embodiment of the decentralized initiative that General Levin H. Campbell had fought to instill in the department. This brings us to a muddy ridge in Europe during the final months of the war. General Campbell stood there, watching a heavy recovery vehicle pull a knocked-out tank from the sludge of a recent engagement. A specialized maintenance team swarmed over the vehicle like a precision crew in a factory. In the old system, this tank would have been written off as a loss and filed away in a bureaucratic ledger. Instead, this team of men who had been recruited from civilian garages and trained in high-pressure schools swapped the engine and repaired the tracks in under an hour. Campbell watched as the tank roared back to life and clattered toward the front. In that moment, the answer to the central question became clear. How did a starving army build the world's greatest weapons machine? The United States did not win simply because it had more factories or more steel. It won because it had broken the bottleneck of centralized control. It had taken the art of ordnance out of the windowless offices of the Pentagon and placed it in the hands of the men in the foxholes. The experts were finally in charge. By August 1945, the fever had broken. The industry ordnance machine, which had spent 5 years operating at a frantic pulse, suddenly faced the silence of peace. Within weeks of the surrender, the multi-billion-dollar flow of hardware began to slow. But to understand the legacy of this era, you have to look past the closing of the factory gates. This was not just the end of a production run, it was the final validation of a radical experiment in human management. The department had overseen a $46 billion program that delivered 47 billion rounds of ammunition and millions of vehicles. As the war ended, the bureaucracy began the grim task of issuing death certificates for the equipment that had survived the global battlefield. Every tank pulverized in the desert and every rifle that jammed in the Pacific was accounted for in 22,000 linear feet of records. This was the final paperwork of a system that had transitioned from a stagnant country club to a massive industrial manager. To understand why this mattered for the decades that followed, we must look at the year 1946. For years, General Levin H. Campbell had fought a bureaucratic war against General Brehon Somervell over the soul of military logistics. Somervell had pushed for a centralized command that treated technical expertise as a secondary concern. But when the Army Service Forces were abolished shortly after the war, the vision held by Campbell was the one that survived. The technical branches regained their autonomy, proving that the specialist could not be folded into a generic supply line. The industry ordnance team became the permanent blueprint for the American industrial state. This transformation was most visible on the factory floor. Before the war, the manufacturing of weapons was a specialized art practiced by a handful of master armorers in government arsenals. By 1945, that art had been distilled into a science of interchangeable parts and mass production. Technical breakthroughs like the bazooka and the complex tank transmission moved from the drawing board to the front line because the department had bridged the gap between invention and combat. They had learned to manage 1,800 distinct equipment models by cutting the elephant into small pieces. But the true legacy was found in the people who had built the machine. The 350,000 workers did not simply go back to the world of 1939. They carried with them a new understanding of what was possible when industrial potential was matched with administrative urgency. They had survived the lean years and the frantic scramble to create a system that could outproduce the world. Think about what this meant for the returning soldier. In a factory in Detroit, a returning sergeant stood on the same floor where the tanks he had used in combat were once assembled. He was no longer the recruit who had been rushed through a 12-week training sprint in a mud-filled camp. He was a man who understood the mechanical heart of his equipment. He met with an aging civilian worker who had spent the war years managing the flow of machine tools and raw materials. The worker and the sergeant held a single, standardized gear between them. Years earlier, a part like this would have required hours of hand-filing by a master machinist just to fit into a single gun carriage. Now, it was a piece of hardware produced by the millions, identical to every other gear in every theater of the war. The worker smiled, and the sergeant gave a quiet nod of recognition. The gear fit. If your father or grandfather worked in one of the Great Lakes factories or served in an ordnance company during the war, I would be honored to read his story in the comments below. Tell us about the plant where he worked, the tools he carried, or the machines he kept running in the field. Those personal memories are the real history of the arsenal of democracy, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to sharing more of these stories with you soon.